I'm Eric. Thanks for joining me today. So I work for a company called Overclock Labs. We really appreciate y'all coming by. And today we're going to talk about our main product, that is Akash Network. We're a core contributor to Akash Network. We also contribute to Cosmos SDK. We're a Cosmos SDK blockchain project. And we also contribute to Tendermint. So yeah, let's talk a bit about it. Decentralized cloud. Akash is a decentralized cloud marketplace for cloud computing. You can run containers on other people's infrastructure, and all the payment for services is done in AKT. So today what I'm going to do is show you how easy it is to actually deploy software onto Akash Network, onto the platform we've built. And if you want, everyone who's here, if you've got a laptop or you want to pull out your laptop, we can have you follow along, because there's a third-party tool that's actually super easy to use. It will run on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. It's called Akashlytics. So you can follow along, and we got a couple of members in the audience. The guy in the striped shirt standing back up there's Adam. He can give you AKT if you want to set up a wallet, and you can try it out for yourself at basically no cost to you. So I'll jump straight to a live demo of how stuff works now, and we'll hope that everything works. So I already have Akashlytics installed, and y'all can see it. And basically, this is the dashboard after you've created a wallet and everything. And there's a big button up here, and this is already connected. And I've already got a wallet up here, and I've got 6 AKT, which is about $2 in US dollars at the moment. So I'll start from empty, and basically I have to tell it what I want to deploy. And to deploy software on Akash, fundamentally everything you run is a Docker container, and you need a way to tell us what Docker containers to run. So we have a language that we call SDL. There's a whole bunch of projects that we already have in a GitHub repository. So I'll just copy one of them to deploy a project that I made specifically for demo purposes. And, well, I said I'll copy it. Maybe I didn't copy it. All right, there we go. So this SDL kind of just describes everything that we're going to deploy. I'm going to deploy 2 different containers with a small amount of CPU and memory attached to each one of them. So I'll hit create deployment, and you have to create a deposit whenever you do that. It's basically how your deployment gets funded. Like any blockchain, or really like any layer 1 blockchain app, you're going to pay some fees in the process. So I'll approve the transaction, which is going to create the deployment. We're now on the path towards running code in the decentralized cloud. So we'll wait a minute here so the transaction goes through. And at this point, it's basically out there, but it's not running anywhere. So we have to wait for what we call bids on our network, which is basically after you've solicited that you're willing to pay to run something, someone can come back and place a bid and says, hey, I've got cloud resources, or I've got servers and can run your containers out there. So I got one bid. I'll just go ahead and accept the bid immediately. And same thing, there's a transaction to accept that bid. So at this point, the network has acknowledged it, and there's basically a handoff that goes on. It gets shipped over to the provider that actually has the resources and hosts my app for me. Everything gets deployed into Kubernetes, if you're familiar with the project. And at that point in time, stuff starts up and starts running. So this is the logs that just got created. And what we can do is we get a URI. And this URI was generated just for my deployment, just so I have a convenient way to access it. So what I built was a very, very minimalist pastebin app. As you can say, very minimalist, because it's mostly a white page, but it does work. So what I can do is come into here, and I can put in a message like, hi, I am presenting at Consensus 2020, what is it, 2022 now, I think? Create the paste, and now at this point in time, I have a paste. So this is just a really simple demo app I created to show everyone how powerful and how quickly you can get stuff running on Akash. And this isn't just like one container that's hosting everything. I actually have multiple containers, and the storage is actually an in-memory database called Redis, if you've ever heard of it, and then the application code I wrote in Go and published it to Docker Hub. So, well, technically GitHub Container Registry, not Docker Hub, sorry, for any technical members out there. So it's an incredibly powerful tool that basically allows you to access compute as an alternative to existing major cloud players that are out there. And we're really hoping to empower basically Web3 apps to access a wider network of compute capacity that's out there at a fraction of the price that you would pay with a major player today. So bright lights are pretty bright, but I think I can see everyone from here. Who is interested in doing a deploy, or who has questions that they'd like me to answer? Not everyone at once. All right. Can we get the mic over to this gentleman, please? Thank you.
We should use token AKT, right?
Yes.
Could you please tell more about that?
Yeah, so Akash, we run our own blockchain and everything. Our token is AKT. So everything is paid for in AKT, and the way the lease works is on a per block basis. You're basically agreeing, a block is about 5 seconds. You're basically agreeing to pay a certain amount of fractional AKT each block to run your whatever software you want to run and whatever containers you want to run in someone else's infrastructure. Does that answer the question?
Can I use ETH and just pay as I go, or I need to buy AKT before that?
Yeah, you would need to take your ETH and swap it through some sort of decentralized exchange or something like that to get AKT.
Got you. Thank you.
Looks like we have another question here.
Could your cost of hosting change after post-deployment?
The way it works today is at the initial start of the deployment, there's an agreed upon rate and it's locked in. If it becomes unagreeable to providers or the person releasing the sources, the way it would work is you kind of close and rebroadcast your bid. In the future, what we definitely want to do is have a way for an existing lease to be renegotiated. Basically, either the provider wants to raise the price because maybe token price has fluctuated, or even the person who's just leasing it wants a lower price because they're saying, hey, you know, token price went way up, you're charging me way more than I need to. So it's not something we can do today, but it's definitely something we're looking at doing in the future.
Question there. So for whoever is bidding to host your app, is there any way to tell whether they're reliable, like basically how reliable their info is? That's my first question. Second question is, what about the storage?
So the first question I'll answer, and the first question is basically, how do you know who's hosting your app? So by default, it's sort of a free-for-all and that anyone can bid on it. But what I can actually show you right here is we have a concept called attributes, and in this case, in the SDL that you just saw me deploy and stand up an app, I specified an organization of Akash.network. So we run some providers, and particularly for the purposes of a live demo, I want to deploy to a provider that we know about. And so the other thing we do is on the network in general, anyone can sign basically a provider and say, I certify these attributes. And one of the things that Overclock Labs and Akash Network is working to do is basically to build a network of trust between people who want to run code, people who want to host infrastructure, and then some sort of service out there that's, we're calling them auditors, that are basically willing to attest that, hey, I really know that this guy has 9 nines of uptime or whatever he's claiming, or I really know he has a 10 gigabit Ethernet, internet connection at his data center and stuff like that. And one of the ways that we're looking at doing that in the future is basically incentivizing auditors, like whenever a lease is created, if their address was used, they might get a small payment to account for that, because we want them to have an economic incentive to be basically active and participating in the community and validating that. And so the other question I think you had was about storage. So storage, when we launched back about a year ago in early 2020, was all ephemeral. So there's ephemeral storage app attached to the container. If the container restarts, it's gone. The mainnet 3 that we launched this year, we actually introduced a feature called persistent storage, where you can actually get persistent storage attached to your deployment. Even if your container restarts, or even if you want to have multiple containers accessing that storage, it persists as long as the deployment is out there. And so that's been our approach so far for persistent storage.
Is it on the same server for the storage?
Yeah, if you're interested in the technical way that we've been doing that, it's a Kubernetes stateful set that's attached to a block storage provider like Rook and Ceph.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions?
No. Is it difficult to deploy infrastructure or hardware on? I mean, how do you go about deploying hardware, or is it all delegators?
So I think the question was, is it difficult to deploy hardware? So you're asking about basically the supply side, like you've got some services and resources you want to sell into the network. So the way that works today is, first thing you would do is basically you've got 10 servers, set those up as one big Kubernetes cluster. And at that point in time, we have an app that deploys onto Kubernetes. And you would have, running in that app, basically a wallet that's attached to what we call a provider. that provider is actively watching the blockchain. And so like when I got a bid earlier, that's our piece of software out there. And it actually looks at your Kubernetes cluster, looks at what isn't in use, looks at those deployments that get created, matches them, and there's some pricing parameters that you can control in there, and then puts those bids on the network. And from that point, it's basically automatic. You get paid on an ongoing basis, not quite per block, but you get paid on an ongoing basis. Does that answer the question?
Basically, I need to read more.
Cool. Yeah, if you want to know more, we'll hang out after the talk for sure outside, and we can talk.
Thank you.
Looks like we got this guy again.
I was going to ask, like, how do you guys manage security if you want to isolate services?
So is the question like I have two containers running on the same machine and you want them to have some degree of isolation?
Yep.
Okay, so each and every deployment, like the one I have running here in Kubernetes, first off, it goes into its own namespace that's isolated from other namespaces. Secondarily, there's basically no way to get from a container to like a provider's internal infrastructure because you're going to be on the network and everything. So we kind of block all that stuff off because there's no reason for you to be accessing their internal infrastructure. The third thing is kind of what I was going back to earlier is if you're deploying and you want to have some degree of security, you should really be using someone's audited attributes that are signed by someone that you've established some link of trust with.
Okay. Can you set up security groups in there?
You can't at this time explicitly specify any security groups. One of the things that we've talked a lot about but haven't had time to build because we're a small team is basically like how would you set up private networking if that's something you want to do? So that's probably pretty close to what you're thinking of. Let me just take a minute to remind you if anyone's interested in deploying an app or wants to try it out, just grab one of my coworkers and you can. Anybody else? Any more questions? Okay, yeah, so I can roll through the demo again if people want to see it. I can actually show you. So this is running, and what I'll do is go in here, I'll click close. Same thing to close the transaction. I'll close it. Close the deployment, you have to broadcast a transaction. Blockchain crypto technology is always fun. So if we come over here, I bet my paste is gone because, yep, 404 not found. Paste doesn't exist because I just closed my deployment. Let me just jump back and then grab another example app. This was actually contributed by the community as far as I remember. And it's really silly, but it is something cool to show. Let's see, where did they go with it? Oh, there it is. So again, I'll just copy that SDL. I'm going to come over here, and then I'll create a new deployment. Same thing. I paste in my SDL, broadcast a transaction. All right, so this is another bid, and I'll accept that one, and we'll spin up that. So I know we had a couple people filter in as I was talking, taking some other questions and everything, so I'll just kind of go over what Akash is really quick. We're a decentralized cloud compute marketplace. We are our own blockchain. We're a layer 1 chain. So you can basically run containers, and that's what I'm doing right now. I've accepted an offer to run a container for $3.90 a month. And it's going to stand it up and everything's going to start. And in this case, I'll also get another URI that I can access it at. And it's still starting, I can assure you, because that's why it got that error. So it'll take a minute more for it to stand up. So yeah, any other questions? Let's see if this is working now. Yeah, so I'm not very good at this game, but I can play. And this is deployed, it's hosted in one of our data centers running on one of our providers and everything, and maybe I can get the block. Nope, too much delay. Any other questions from people out in the audience or people who've rolled in? Yeah, we got a guy back there with a cell phone.
What's your most popular app?
I think the most popular app we've had deployed is anyone hosting web stuff just because it's simple. And the other thing we had a lot of traction with unexpectedly was basically CPU miners. I don't know the economics of that, but apparently there's a lot of people who somehow or another acquired AKT and are willing to use it to mine packet, Bitcoin, stuff like that. So unexpectedly, we got a lot of traction there, but I think that's been one of our more popular things so far. But we're really hoping to bring in more like web developers and stuff like that. Yeah, so absolutely, we're built on Cosmos SDK. Was the question, well, what's our layer 0? We're layer 1. We're built on Cosmos SDK and everything. And we picked Oh yeah, we picked Cosmos just because honestly, the community is pretty broad. There's a lot of different contributors, and it's a really easy blockchain to work with. From my perspective, it's really easy to get going with. I'm also been a Go developer. I develop on our core blockchain product, but I've been a Go developer basically since version 1. So I'm really familiar with that sort of ecosystem and everything. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So how does scalability work? If you launch an application, it needs to scale. How do you guys handle that? Let's say initially the infrastructure looks like it can handle it. What happens when you need to scale?
So are you asking from scalability of like the app I deployed or versus like the scalability of the infrastructure I'm running on?
What you're running on. So if the application starts to require more resources, it's seeing more usage. How does can it auto scale?
So no, unfortunately, this time we don't have auto scaling, but that's very similar to sort of like the earlier question where I said people would want to renegotiate their rate. Whenever we introduce a feature like that, not only would you be able to say, hey, I need a cheaper rate because the token price is way up today, you would have the option to say, like, this is just a 0.1 copy of a container. If you wanted more resources, you could crank up the amount of CPU you're requesting, or you could crank up the number of containers at that time, and then ask basically what price is that going to cost me. The way that you have to do that today, unfortunately, is to close your deployment or start a new one somewhere and then close the existing one. But we want to make all of that at least have the possibility to be renegotiated on an ongoing basis.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions out there? One second. Let me let the mic get over to you. Thank you.
How do you deal with malicious actors if the servers are not providing the reliable service, or if the app developer is using more resources than he should?
So on the app developer side, it's pretty straightforward. Since everything's deployed into Kubernetes, Kubernetes actually enforces limits pretty strictly. Like this storage, for example, if you blow past that, your container's dead in the water immediately. Memory is a little bit, I guess, more flexible, but it'll also kill your container eventually if you use too much memory. So if you're using more resources than you asked for, that's pretty easy. CPU is capped at the way it's scheduled in the OS with the, we use Containerd as the virtualization layer for containers. There's no like hypervisor going on here, for example. So that's how it's handled on basically the app side. On the provider side, it really goes back to what I was saying earlier, and it's really about trusting auditors who audit any provider out there. But the other thing is, since you could negotiate a lease where, let's say it's a tremendous amount of resources, $100 a month or $1,000 a month, you're paying on a block for block basis. So if you open up a lease, even if it's actually a very big lease, if it just doesn't perform to your expectations, you've only paid for a small number of blocks. 5 seconds is a block. 10 minutes is a finite number of blocks. You've paid a very small amount and everything like that. So this is very different from saying, oh, I'm going to host in a data center and I'm going to pay monthly, or I'm going to pay yearly. I know AWS does like I guess what you'd call a preferred rate type thing, but anything like that, it's completely different. You can end the lease at any time if you don't feel it's meeting your expectations and move to another provider on the network. This guy again.
Just want to ask, do you guys provide container metrics? So this container you've deployed, for instance, are you able to see the metrics on it?
You could see some different stuff out there. So one of the things we've been wanting to do, this is more or less just a copy of what I deployed. One of the things we've been wanting to do is actually expose more detail about that, like is it maxed out on its CPU as an app developer, is thing you want to know immediately. One of the things I added as a developer quite a while back was, let's see, Does their thing work? No. So one of the things I added a while back was you can get a shell into any container you've ran out there. So it's crude at the moment, but you can actually just go into the container and run top if you want to see what kind of resources you're using. Just like if it was a conventional VM or anything like that, you have shell access. But one of the other things we want to do, pull back to end users, is the Kubernetes metrics server. If you're familiar with that, we pretty much advise everyone to run that anyway, so we really need to surface those metrics back to end users.
Okay.
This gentleman has another question. Can you bring the mic to this guy here? Thank you.
So I'm sure you made a lot of trades by now, right?
Sorry, what's the question?
Based on your past trades, how do you compare the pricing of AWS versus your network?
How do we compare the pricing for AWS versus our network? So we only offer compute, so like other services like S3, we're not comparing that at all, just to be clear. But in general, our message has been we're 10 times cheaper just because we're able to access resources at a fraction of the cost that AWS does at this time. So in general, the message we've tried to point out is we're 10 times cheaper. So the thing with AWS is, I know in a previous job I looked into running I believe they call it Elastic Container Service. It's basically our Elastic Kubernetes. It's basically a managed Kubernetes, except they still require you to provision a very large set of servers just to stand up a minimalist Kubernetes cluster, from what I remember. So you're not paying that huge like entry-level tax if you have a small app or you're a small startup that you want to run. Any other questions out there? I don't think anyone over there. Anything else someone wants me to demo or see here up on stage today? All right. Well, thanks, guys. We appreciate you dropping in. Oh, there's another question. For all the dApps, no, we do maintain this GitHub project called Awesome Akash that just is a bunch of community contributed things that you can deploy. All of these should be working SDLs that you can basically copy paste like you saw me do into it. We actually don't know, that's a great point for me to talk about, we actually don't know specifically what's running on the wider network. Whenever you make a deployment, the actual thing that goes on the network is basically just a description of the resources like this. I want one CPU, 512 megabytes of memory, and whatever amount of storage that happens to be. So it's actually just a description of that. So that information is actually private because the information of what you're buying that needs to be on the chain basically so everyone knows what's being bought and sold. But the actual Docker containers is kept private between the deployment owner was the term we use and the provider. So we actually don't have that information for every provider on the network. Looks like we had a question with this gentleman.
I remember when I researched before, there was a dashboard on Akash in terms of like users and like numbers of users, that kind of things, and that was not very increasing.
I think you're talking about this, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we saw a lot of adoption, and honestly, Akash Lytics. So they're not directly affiliated with Overclock Labs, my employer, or Akash. Obviously, they're built on Akash, and we do use them for demos and stuff. But one of the things that we're looking at is basically coming up with our own usage numbers, because we've looked into these numbers, and there are inaccuracies in these. There are generally representative of the network, but at the moment, one of the things that we're working on is really like, how do we get more developers to use Akash? Because if someone has to be an expert in the system, there's really no advantage to them. There's no value to them. So one of the things we're looking at internally is how do we lower that barrier to entry and onboard more people to using Akash on an ongoing basis. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, so my question was about like the threshold, like clients and like reluctant to enter into like a cache. So you mostly answered the question, but could you give some more detail on it, like how can solve that?
Like how we can lower barriers to entry?
Sure.
So honestly, one of the biggest things is this dashboard's neat and it works well, but you can't run a company with it. We have another product, which I'm not going to demo today because it's very involved, called the CLI. And what we've ran into is the CLI is super raw. It's like the Bitcoin CLI, for example. Any Bitcoin CLI level app, you can broadcast any transaction you want in it. That's very, very raw. So the biggest thing I think we're looking into as a company is giving people an on-ramp that goes not from, oh, I'm a crypto user who wants to run code, but taking them from the on-ramp of, I am interested in accessing decentralized compute. Okay, go to one of these major players and do whatever onboarding you need to do to get AKT, and then from there, they can move directly into running an app without having to be a crypto expert or a crypto native, if you want to call them that. I know that term gets thrown out a lot, but I think that's sort of the biggest obstacle is at an event like this, there's a lot of crypto experts in the room and people generally know what's going on, but just if we want to reach millions of developers, and we do, they need to be aware of like loosely how the network works, but they don't need to know every detail. That is one thing that Akash does very well, is this sort of information. We don't have a comparable app yet, and that's absolutely what we want to do as a company for the platform, is just showing them what am I paying, how much money do I have, and stuff like that. So I know a couple people filtered in and everything, so I'll just mention to everyone that, yeah, I'm Eric. I work for Overclock Labs, and we build Akash Network, which is the decentralized marketplace for cloud compute. So any other questions out there? Any other questions? Yeah. I think my question is, what are the thoughts on growing as IBC?
Yeah, as part of the IBC.
Okay.
Do you have anything like?
Well, I can tell you I personally wrote an osmosis validator. So that's one thing. But, oh, thanks. Hydrogen 18, if you want to look it up. Well, it's okay. Everyone stopped right now, but that's a separate conversation. But nonetheless, I think Cosmos has a pretty large amount of market traction, and I think it has the ability to onboard more interesting apps in a faster pace, because I don't really get too much involved in like the Ethereum blockchain and stuff, but we aren't at the level of basically pain that it comes to run stuff on Ethereum layer 2 and everything like that. So I think the outlook, my personal outlook for Cosmos IBC is very good over the next couple of years. There's I can just tell you in the Osmosis community alone, which is very decentralized, is a massive group of incredibly motivated people and incredibly motivated companies to see everything become a success. Even if you're up to date on the current sort of event of things, even hours after an issue was identified, people were already parsing through, what went wrong, what's the financial impact of this, is there any impact at all to end users and stuff like that. So I think I'm very, very bullish on the Cosmos interblockchain. All right. Yeah, if there's no other questions or anything like that, I think I'm just going to wrap it up. All right, thanks, guys.